"I need affection," she whispered, and the millionaire knew that night would change everything. A secret neither of them expected was about to surface, a truth that would transform their lives forever. Where are you watching this story from? Subscribe to the channel and leave a like because the ending will move you deeply. Sometimes lost souls find refuge in the most unexpected places. Rain hammered violently against the windows of the penthouse apartment while Emily stood there, trembling not just from the cold that penetrated her bones, but from terror at the thought of returning to where she'd fled that night. Her soaked dress clung to her slender frame, and her chestnut hair formed dark rivulets down her bare shoulders. Outside, Manhattan glittered with 1,000 lights reflecting off the wet pavement, creating an impressionist painting of the sleeping city. When her words came out, "I need tenderness," it was as if all the armor James had built over 42 years began to crack. He, the entrepreneur feared in boardrooms, the man who never showed weakness, felt something awaken within him as he looked into those hazel eyes filled with tears and hope. Emily had appeared in the lobby of Manhattan's most luxurious building at 3 in the morning, without documents, without luggage, just a fragmented story about fleeing a situation that was suffocating her. The doorman, Mr. Rodriguez, recognizing the urgency and innocence in that frightened face, had hesitated long before contacting the only resident still awake. James, the millionaire everyone knew, never slept before dawn, always busy with international deals across 3 continents. When he opened the massive door of his penthouse and saw her there, barefoot and drenched, resembling a nymph escaped from a Baroque fountain, something in her vulnerable expression touched a part of him that had been sleeping since childhood, when he too had known bewilderment. "Come in," he murmured in a voice hoarse with surprise and something else he couldn't yet name. "You'll catch your death." Emily crossed the threshold with hesitant steps, leaving wet footprints on the Italian marble. Her lips trembled, and she wrapped her arms around herself in an instinctive gesture of protection. James felt a protective urge he believed he'd lost decades ago, since boardrooms had transformed him into a cold, calculating strategist. I'm sorry," she stammered, her soft voice betraying a southern accent. "I didn't know where to go." "The doorman said you might—" "Sit down," he interrupted gently, indicating the leather sofa near the electric fireplace. "I'll get towels and dry clothes." As he walked toward the guest room, James wondered what was happening to him. In 42 years of carefully orchestrated life, he'd never deviated from his routine. Yet something about this young woman, her fragility mixed with a visible determination in her raised chin, provoked in him a strange desire to protect her. The first days passed in a delicate dance of respectful distance and mutual curiosity. Emily occupied the guest room, a spacious suite with a view of Central Park, decorated in shades of grey and white, so impersonal it seemed to belong to a design magazine rather than a home. James maintained his usual routine, providing appropriate clothes, simple but elegant outfits he had delivered from a discreet boutique, meals prepared by Mrs. Chen, his cook, and the space for her to process recent trauma. Emily was 23 years old, he discovered bit by bit through cautious conversations during breakfast. She'd grown up in a small town in Tennessee, near Nashville, where everyone had known each other for generations and traditions were preserved with almost religious fervor. Mornings she sat by the large window, watching the city wake slowly, and James often caught her with an expression of melancholy that squeezed his heart. "Do you miss home?" he asked one morning, coffee in hand, standing by the glass table where she nibbled a croissant. Emily looked up at him, and for the first time he saw a complexity of emotions cross her face. "Yes and no," she answered honestly. "I miss my family, the magnolia trees, the smell of honeysuckle, Sunday church. But," she hesitated, searching for the right words, "I don't regret leaving." James sat across from her, an unusual decision for someone who always took meals standing, reading financial newspapers on his tablet. "Tell me what you ran from." She'd fled an arranged marriage by the family. There was no physical violence, she insisted, but the psychological pressure had become unbearable when she realized her entire life would be decided by others. The fiancé wasn't cruel, just predictable. A young man from town who would take over his family's farm, who expected her to become the perfect wife, the devoted mother, the keeper of traditions. "I would have disappeared," she murmured, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Not physically, but inside. I would have lived the life everyone expected of me, and one day I would have looked in the mirror without recognizing the woman staring back. Those words resonated in James in a way he never would have thought possible. Wasn't that exactly what had happened to him? He'd built a life of appearances, efficiency, success measurable in millions of dollars, but somewhere along the way, he'd lost the man who once dreamed of painting, of traveling without an itinerary, of loving without calculation. "I understand," he said simply, and in those two words Emily felt a connection she'd never experienced before. As days passed, James watched fascinated as she marveled at details he considered mundane. The panoramic elevator descending 20 floors offered a changing view of Manhattan that made her smile every time. The view of the illuminated city at night drew childlike exclamations of joy. The taste of imported Colombian coffee he drank daily seemed a gustatory revelation to her. She possessed a purity of spirit he believed he'd lost decades earlier, when he'd chosen the path of ruthless business. Her most striking characteristic was the ability to find beauty in small things. Flowers blooming in the vertical garden on the balcony, birds singing as they visited feeders she'd installed herself with touching determination, the smell of homemade cornbread she insisted on making, despite the staff at her disposal. "Why do you do this, Mrs.?" Jan asked one day, finding Emily with her hands deep in flour preparing a peach cobbler. "Because cooking is love made tangible," Emily replied with a smile that completely transformed her face. "My grandmother taught me that. Every ingredient is an attention, every gesture is an intention." Mrs. Chen, who had cooked for 30 years as an efficient job but without passion, felt something awaken in her. This young woman had the gift of reminding people why they'd started doing what they did. James's internal conflict became evident when he began cancelling important meetings just to have lunch with Emily, listening to stories about her simple childhood filled with genuine affection. He'd built a financial empire, real estate investments in 12 countries, stakes in tech startups, boards of directors of 3 multinationals, at the price of superficial relationships and a deep loneliness he filled with obsessive work. Now, for the first time in 20 years, he questioned whether all that power was truly worth the absence of real human connection. His therapist, Dr. Morrison, whom he'd visited every Thursday afternoon for 5 years to treat chronic anxiety and persistent insomnia, immediately noticed the change in his expression. "James, you're smiling," she observed during their weekly session, adjusting her glasses with curiosity. "It's the first time in 5 years I've seen you really smile." He straightened on the comfortable couch, uncomfortable with his own transparency. "There's someone staying with me temporarily." "Temporarily?" "Doctor," Morrison repeated, noting how his voice betrayed a hope he was trying to conceal. "A young woman who needed help." James hesitated, then the words came out like a long-held river. "She makes me see the world differently. Things I've ignored for years. The sunset, the taste of a carefully prepared meal, comfortable silence between 2 people. She makes me feel alive. And that frightens you," the therapist stated gently. "Terribly," he admitted. "I'm 42, she's 23. I've built walls so high I don't even know if I'm still capable of love. What if I hurt her? What if my coldness, which everyone knows in the business world, ends up extinguishing her? Or perhaps," Dr. Morrison suggested, "her light could warm you." During the first 3 months, Emily learned to navigate the big city with James's discreet help. He enrolled her in an interior design course at Parsons School of Design. She'd always shown interest in colors and decoration, revealing a natural eye for visual harmonies. She progressively transformed the minimalist penthouse into a more welcoming space with subtle touches of plants and natural textures, quilts with patterns that reminded her of home. "You don't like it?" she asked timidly one evening, having arranged embroidered pillows on the rigid living room sofa. James observed the transformation, feeling a knot form in his throat. The penthouse finally resembled a home rather than a luxury hotel suite. "I like it," he answered honestly. "You make everything more human." Emily, in turn, began to understand the fears inhabiting this apparently invulnerable man. In his distracted moments, when he believed no one was watching, she saw the loneliness in his blue eyes. She sometimes heard him talking on the phone with harshness, negotiating contracts with a coldness that totally contrasted with the kindness he showed her. One evening, she found an old photograph fallen from a book he was reading. Two children, a serious boy about 10 years old and a laughing little girl, in front of a country house. "Is this you?" she asked, delicately holding the yellowed photo. James paled slightly but nodded. "Me and my sister Claire. It was before—" He stopped abruptly. "Before what?" "Before I became this," he replied with bitterness, making a vague gesture toward the luxurious penthouse, toward the life he'd built. "My father lost everything in poorly planned business deals. We had to sell that house. He died of a heart attack 2 years later, broken by failure. I swore I would never be weak like him, that money would never be lacking." Emily placed her hand on his, a simple but understanding-laden gesture. "But at what price, James?" That question hung in the air, an uncomfortable truth he wasn't yet ready to completely face. The first twist came on a sunny Tuesday morning when her family appeared in the building's lobby. Emily was having coffee, chatting cheerfully with Mrs. Chen about herbs from the farmer's market, when the intercom rang. Mr. Rodriguez's face appeared on the screen, grave and worried. "Miss Emily, there are people asking to see you. They say they're your family." Emily's blood froze in her veins. She set down the cup with trembling hands, all her muscles tensing instinctively like an animal ready to flee. James, who was working in his study, came out hearing Mr. Rodriguez's distressed tone. "I'm going down with her," he announced firmly, taking his jacket. In the luxurious lobby, a surreal tableau awaited them. Her father, Robert, a robust man with a face weathered by the Tennessee sun, wore his best Sunday suit, clearly uncomfortable in this opulent environment. Her mother, Margaret, hands clasped nervously, had the red eyes of someone who'd cried during the long journey. And behind them, embarrassed and clearly under pressure from both families, stood Thomas, the chosen fiancé, holding a bouquet of already wilted flowers from the trip. "Emily," Robert began in a voice that wanted to be authoritative but betrayed pleading, "we've come to take you home. This madness has gone on long enough." "Dad," Emily murmured, her courage faltering before the man who dictated every aspect of her life for 23 years. "Who is this man?" Robert asked abruptly, staring at James with suspicion. "What has he promised you? Money? An easy life?" James felt anger rise in him. How dare they presume his intentions? But he restrained himself, remembering Dr. Morrison's words, "Your power lies in your calm, not your strength." "Sir," he said with icy politeness, "I've promised her nothing. Emily is here because she needed refuge, and I offered her a safe space to make her own decisions." "Her own decisions?" Margaret burst into tears. "She's our daughter. She has responsibilities to her family, to her fiancé." Thomas, visibly uncomfortable, intervened for the first time. "Emily, I don't want to force you, but our families, the arrangements, the whole town is talking." James took an unexpected position. Instead of using his power and influence to intimidate them, he could have called security, threatened with lawyers, used his social weight. He simply took Emily's hand and asked softly, "What do you want, Emily?" This gesture of silent support, respecting her autonomy rather than deciding for her, was more powerful than any speech. Emily felt a new strength rise in her, a clarity she'd never experienced. "Dad, Mom," she began, her voice trembling but determined, "I love you. You raised me with all the love you knew how to give, but I can't live the life you chose for me." She looked at Thomas with compassion. "You're a good man, Thomas. You deserve someone who truly loves you, not someone who resigns herself to marrying you out of obligation." "You dishonor us," Robert murmured, but his voice lacked conviction. "I honor myself," Emily responded, surprised by her own firmness. "And one day I hope you'll understand that I'm not rejecting you. I'm simply choosing myself for the first time in my life." The family finally left, leaving behind a heavy silence and promises to return. Emily collapsed into James's arms as soon as the elevator closed on them, releasing the tears she'd held back. "I'm so proud of you," he murmured into her hair, feeling something change irrevocably between them. Emily's refusal to return triggered a turbulent period that tested the resilience of her spirit and the sincerity of her convictions. Insistent calls at all hours of day and night, endless religious messages about filial duty transmitted by compassionate cousins, letters from the town pastor invoking sacraments and tradition, veiled threats of disinheritance. Everything arrived daily, like an incessant tide. James witnessed her anguish, seeing her cry hidden in the bathroom after each contact with her family, but also observed her growing strength, with an admiration slowly transforming into something deeper. She began establishing boundaries, responding with firmness but without anger, patiently explaining she loved her family but wouldn't give up choosing her own path. "You know what's funny?" she said one evening, sitting on the balcony watching Manhattan's lights sparkle like earthly stars. "I was always considered the obedient daughter, good little Emily who never caused problems, and now I'm the family rebel." James sat beside her, 2 glasses of Napa Valley Cabernet in hand. "You're not a rebel. You're courageous. There's a difference." "Really?" She looked at him, searching his blue eyes for a truth she needed to hear. "Sometimes I wonder if I did the right thing, if the price of my freedom won't be losing my family forever." "Freedom always has a price," James replied, thinking of his own journey. "The question is whether you're ready to pay it." This determination of Emily's impressed James deeply and made him question his own lack of courage in similar situations throughout his life. How many times had he sacrificed his true desires on ambition's altar? How many relationships had he sabotaged because they required vulnerability? A particularly difficult decision for James came when his main partner, Richard Sterling, a ruthless man who'd been his mentor for 15 years, made him an attractive proposal, an investment in an Asian production chain that would yield millions, but whose labor practices were, diplomatically speaking, questionable. "James, it's guaranteed profit," Richard insisted during a business lunch. "Since when have you become so concerned with ethics? This is business." Before Emily, James would have accepted without hesitation, convincing himself the business world had its own rules. But now he heard her soft voice asking, "At what price?" "I refuse," he announced calmly, seeing surprise then anger invade Richard's face. "You're getting soft, James. That girl is making you lose your instinct." "No," James replied, standing up and leaving money on the table. "She's making me find my conscience again." This break with Richard represented a fracture in his carefully constructed professional life, but also a liberation he hadn't anticipated. He began reviewing all his investments, wondering how many other compromises he'd made without questioning. Emily's design courses proved to be a revelation for her. She excelled particularly in creating spaces that balanced beauty and functionality, but with a sensitivity for human comfort that impressed her professors. Professor Anderson, the department head, called her after the presentation of her first major project. "Miss Williams," he began. She used her grandmother's maiden name to avoid being easily found. "Your work possesses something rare. You don't design spaces to impress, you create them to welcome." "That's a gift." Emily beamed under the compliment, realizing for the first time she had her own talent, a creative voice that deserved to be heard. She ran to tell James, finding him in his study, brow furrowed over financial reports. "James, Professor Anderson said I have a gift," she exclaimed, her cheeks flushed with excitement. He looked up, and his usually severe face transformed with an authentic smile. "Of course you have a gift. I've been telling you from the beginning, but this is different." She sat on the edge of his desk, a familiar gesture she never would have dared at first. "It's someone who truly understands design saying it. It's validating." James placed his hand on hers, an electric contact they both felt, but neither dared yet name. "Emily, you don't need external validation. Your worth doesn't depend on what others think of you." "Like you?" she teased gently. "The man who lives for stock numbers and board approval?" He laughed, a rare and precious sound. "Touché. Maybe we're teaching each other." In the 4th month, something happened that neither of them expected. Claire, James's younger sister, with whom he hadn't spoken for 7 years, after a bitter dispute over family properties, when their mother decided to move to live with her in Boston, appeared at the penthouse on a rainy Saturday afternoon. Emily alone at home. James was at his squash club, trying to maintain at least one routine from his previous life, opened the door to find an elegant woman of about 35, auburn hair pulled into a chignon, with the same piercing blue eyes as James. "You must be Emily," Claire said with a hesitant smile. "I'm Claire, James's sister. Is he here?" "He'll be back in an hour," Emily replied, remembering the photograph of children she'd seen. "Would you like to come in?" Claire hesitated on the threshold, visibly nervous. "I don't want to impose." "Come in," Emily insisted, with the natural hospitality of someone raised in a culture of open doors. "I'll make coffee." In the bright kitchen, Emily prepared coffee while Claire observed the transformed penthouse with curiosity. The quilted pillows, green plants overflowing from their pots, small touches of color softening the austere minimalism. Everything spoke of an attentive feminine presence. "You've changed this place," Claire observed. "The last time I came, it was 8 years ago. It was like a museum, cold and impersonal." Emily arranged homemade pecan cookies on a tray. Her grandmother had taught her that nothing opens hearts like a shared sweet, and brought them to the living room. "James says I make everything too warm. Does he complain?" Claire asked with a knowing smile. "No," Emily admitted, blushing slightly. "He seems to appreciate it." The two women began talking, first cautiously, then with growing ease. Claire spoke of her life in Boston, her work as an art conservator, her passion for quilting that she practiced as meditation. Emily, in turn, shared stories of Tennessee, showing Claire some quilts her own grandmother had made, delicate coverlets adorned with magnolia and dogwood patterns. "My grandmother said every stitch is like a prayer," Emily explained, tracing the patterns with her fingers. "An intention woven into the fabric." "Mine said the same thing," Claire murmured, moved. "She's the one who taught me." James and I spent hours watching her quilt when we were children. When James returned from the gym, still in workout clothes with a bag over his shoulder, and found the two chatting cheerfully about cross-stitch techniques, he froze completely. 7 years of silence, 7 years of carefully cultivated anger, and here they were laughing together like old friends. "Claire," he said, his voice strangely hoarse. "James," she replied, standing up, suddenly as nervous as he was. Emily felt the electric tension in the air and stood up discreetly. I'll go for a walk. You two need to talk." "No," they said simultaneously, then exchanged a surprised look. "Stay, Emily," James continued. "I want you to stay." During the next hour, brother and sister talked with painful sincerity, untangling years of misunderstandings and resentments. The dispute over family property. Claire thought James wanted to sell for profit. James believed Claire was manipulating their mother to distance her from him. But beneath these accusations lay deeper wounds. James had felt abandoned when Claire moved away. Claire had felt rejected by her brother's growing success that seemed to no longer need family. "You became so distant after Dad died," Claire murmured, tears flowing freely. "You built this wall around yourself, and I didn't know how to cross it." "Because I was afraid," James admitted, his own voice trembling. "Afraid of becoming like him, afraid of failing and losing everything. So I sacrificed everything, including you, for success." Emily, silent witness to this reconciliation, felt her heart squeeze. James's presence in her life had changed her, but she was beginning to realize their connection was transforming him too, breaking down the walls he'd meticulously erected. The reconciliation with Claire wasn't instantaneous. Decades of distance don't fill in an afternoon, but it was a beginning, a crack in the armor allowing light to enter. Claire began visiting regularly, sharing meals with them, telling stories of their childhood that sometimes made James laugh with a frank and rare laugh. Emily prepared traditional Southern recipes that reminded James and Claire of their shared childhood. Fragrant chicken and dumplings with fresh herbs, shrimp and grits where coastal flavors sang, buttermilk biscuits served with honey butter. These meals became healing rituals, where difficult conversations alternated with nostalgic laughter. The second great transformation occurred when James decided to take Emily to discover the ranch in Wyoming that his grandfather had left him years before. It was in Jackson Hole, surrounded by century-old pines and golden wildflower meadows rippling in the summer wind, with an old log house that needed renovations but retained the rustic charm of 19th-century construction. The drive took 8 hours, during which they talked about everything and nothing: music, books, abandoned childhood dreams. James drove with one relaxed hand on the wheel, the other resting near the gear shift where Emily occasionally brushed it, creating electric sparks neither mentioned. When they arrived, the sun was beginning to descend, painting the meadows with liquid gold. Emily got out of the car and stood still, captivated by the wild beauty of the landscape. "It's magnificent," she murmured. James watched her instead of the landscape, realizing what was magnificent to him was no longer the place, but the way she illuminated it with her wonder. Emily instantly fell in love with the place, especially the large kitchen with an ancient stone fireplace, where she already imagined bread coming from the oven, and the stone patio where you could watch the orange sunset paint the infinite horizon. That night, sitting on that patio under a sky saturated with stars never seen in Manhattan, far from the city and social expectations, they talked for the first time about what they truly felt for each other. The air smelled of sage and pine, and the silence was only interrupted by crickets singing their nocturnal serenade. "I'm terrified," James began, his voice barely louder than a whisper, "of hurting you, of not being enough for you." Emily turned to him, her hazel eyes shining in the moonlight. "Why do you think you're not enough? Look at us, Emily." He made a gesture encompassing their invisible but omnipresent differences. "I'm 42, you're 23. 19 years separate us. I've lived a whole life of hardening and compromises. You're just beginning to discover who you really are. My experiences, my mistakes, my reputation." "You think age is what defines us," she interrupted gently. "James, I may be 23, but I've lived enough to know that what matters isn't how long you've lived, but how you choose to live from now on." "But people will talk," he insisted, thinking of gossip magazines, conservative boards, inevitable judgments. "Let them talk," Emily replied, with a determination that surprised him. "I fled an entire town that was talking. Do you think a few magazines scare me?" James took her hand, intertwining their fingers, a gesture at once simple and monumentally significant. "True love isn't about perfection or convenience," he murmured, repeating words she'd told him weeks before, "but about consciously choosing to care for each other every day." "You were listening to me," she smiled through happy tears. "I always listen," he admitted. "You taught me to really listen, not just to words, but to what's behind them." The kiss, when it came, was sweet and hesitant, charged with all the unspoken feelings of the past 4 months. Under Wyoming's starry sky, surrounded by the nocturnal sounds of the countryside, crickets, owls, wind in the pines, they crossed the threshold from friendship towards something deeper and inevitably transformative. The following days at the ranch were like a bubble outside time. They explored local farmers' markets, buying artisanal cheeses and homemade preserves. Emily cooked in the large fireplace, resurrecting ancient recipes. James, for the first time in 20 years, didn't check his professional emails even once, completely disconnecting from the empire that had dictated every minute of his existence. "I didn't know I could be happy simply," he confessed one morning, watching Emily pick ripe cherries from the garden tree, her summer dress floating in the breeze. Without accomplishing something, without advancing a project, just being. Returning to New York a week later, they were no longer the same people who'd left. Their relationship was now openly acknowledged between them, though they chose to keep it private from the outside world. James began making decisions that deeply shocked his social and professional circle. He reduced his workload by half, delegating responsibilities he'd previously considered non-transferable to competent vice presidents he'd neglected for years. He began investing in social projects, Emily suggested, a shelter for at-risk youth, a design mentorship program for disadvantaged students, a foundation to help women escaping oppressive situations. "You're changing my vision of what success means," he told her one evening, scrolling through project proposals she'd compiled with passion. "I'm not changing anything," Emily replied. "I'm just helping you find the person you were before you thought you had to be someone else." But every transformation carries its moments of doubt, and James wasn't exempt from relapses into his old patterns. One morning, 3 months after their mutual declaration, Emily found him in his study, features drawn from insomnia, surrounded by alarming financial reports. "What's happening?" she asked, worried, seeing the dark circles under his eyes. "I made a mistake," he murmured, his voice filled with a despair she didn't know in him. "A major investment in a tech company. They just announced a data breach scandal. The stock plummeted 60%. I'm going to lose millions." Emily sat across from him, observing how his hands trembled slightly as he held the printed sheets. "Does this threaten your overall financial situation?" "No," he admitted. "I've diversified enough, but my reputation... People trusted me, invested on my recommendations. Some lost everything." Then help them, Emily suggested simply. What? You have the means. If people lost because of your advice, use your fortune to help them. It's not a legal obligation, but it's morally right. James looked at her, as if she'd just suggested the impossible. Emily, that's not how business works. Losses are part of the risk. Maybe that's exactly the problem, she replied calmly. Maybe the old James wouldn't do that. But who do you want to be now? This conversation triggered an internal crisis that lasted weeks. James consulted his lawyers, who strongly advised against any voluntary compensation. He consulted his partners, who called him crazy. He even consulted Dr. Morrison, who simply asked, "Can you live with yourself if you don't?" Finally, James established a compensation fund for small investors who'd followed his recommendation, using his own personal fortune. The decision made headlines, some praising him for exceptional integrity, others ridiculing him for naivety and weakness. "You've become the laughingstock of boardrooms," an old friend told him during a tense lunch. "What's happening to you, James? Since when have you become so sentimental?" "Since I met someone who reminded me I'm human before I'm a businessman," he replied simply. But the emotional price of these decisions was heavy. James woke in the middle of the night, questioning every choice, wondering if he wasn't destroying everything he'd built. Emily often found him standing on the balcony at 3 in the morning, staring at Manhattan's lights with a haunted expression. "Do you regret it?" she asked one night, wrapping herself in a blanket beside him. "I don't know," he admitted honestly. "I spent 20 years building a reputation as a ruthless but reliable man. Now I don't know who I am anymore. Am I James Bennett, the finance shark? Or am I the man who makes you breakfast on Sunday mornings?" "Why must you choose?" Emily asked. "Why can't you be both? A man can be strong in business and gentle at home." "Because the world doesn't work that way," he replied bitterly. "The business world only respects strength. Kindness is perceived as weakness." Emily felt a crack in their relationship, not a break, but a tension. James was beginning to subtly resent her, even if he didn't consciously admit it. She represented change, and change was uncomfortable, sometimes even terrifying. Things became more complicated when a financial scandal involving his former partner Richard exploded in American media. Richard was accused of embezzlement, corruption, and market manipulation. Although James hadn't participated in the illegal acts he'd broken with Richard months before, his reputation was tarnished by association. Newspapers love a full story, and James Bennett, the former shark-turned-philanthropist, made a fascinating target. The headlines were cruel. Bennett, accomplice or naive. Fall of an empire. Scandal rocks high finance. Did love make him blind? Accompanied by photos of him and Emily leaving the building, Emily found herself at the center of media attention she'd never asked for. Photographers camped outside the building. Journalists dug into her past, discovering the story of her flight from Tennessee, contacting her family, creating a narrative of the young woman who bewitched the millionaire. "I'm sorry," she cried one evening, reading a particularly venomous article describing her as a calculating social climber. "It's not your fault," James replied, but his voice lacked conviction. The pressure was immense. His clients withdrew their investments. Boards demanded his resignation. His fortune, though still substantial, was rapidly diminishing. For the first time in his life, instead of hiring aggressive lawyers and smothering the situation with money and legal threats, James chose transparency. He gave honest interviews, opening his financial records to an independent audit, publicly explaining why he'd broken with Richard, accepting the public vulnerability this represented. "Why are you doing this?" his chief lawyer asked, horrified. "You're exposing yourself unnecessarily." "Because the truth is the only defense I have," James replied, "and because I no longer want to live hiding who I really am." But the audit revealed unexpected complications. Some of his past investments, though legal, were ethically questionable. Companies with dubious labor practices, real estate projects that had displaced poor communities, hedge funds profiting from economic crises. James was forced to confront the man he'd been, and it was devastating. "I'm no better than Richard," he murmured one night, collapsed on his study floor, surrounded by documents detailing 2 decades of moral compromises. "I was just more careful, more legal." But the damage? Emily found him there, and for the first time didn't know what to say, how to console someone confronting the uncomfortable truth of who they'd been. She simply sat beside him, placing her hand on his trembling back, offering her silent presence. "Maybe I don't deserve your love," he murmured. "Maybe you should leave before I destroy you too." "James," she said firmly, forcing him to look at her, "listen to me. You're not defined by your past mistakes. You're defined by what you choose to do now. But how can I repair 20 years of damage?" "One day at a time," she replied simply, with intention and humility. During this dark period, their relationship was tested in ways neither had anticipated. James became irritable, distant, sometimes frankly unpleasant. He rejected Emily's affection, locking himself in his study for days. He began having severe insomnia again, losing weight, neglecting his health. Emily, for her part, felt helpless. Her design courses continued, but she had difficulty concentrating, always worried about James. Some of her classmates had read the articles and looked at her differently now. With pity or judgment, she didn't always know which was worse. Claire became an essential pillar during this storm. She came regularly, bringing prepared meals, forcing James to eat, talking with Emily when she needed someone who understood her brother's complexity. "He builds walls when he's afraid," Claire explained one afternoon, making tea in the kitchen. "He's always done it, since we were children." Dad would yell and James would retreat to his room, silent and impenetrable. "You have to be patient." "What if he pushes me away completely?" Emily asked, her own fear showing. "Then you decide if you're ready to stay anyway," Claire answered honestly. Loving someone doesn't mean fixing their wounds. It means being present while they fix themselves. The ordeal culminated when an emergency board meeting of his main holding company was called. Shareholders demanded his immediate resignation, arguing the scandal was harming the company's image. James prepared for the meeting with a resignation that broke Emily's heart. "I'll probably lose everything," he said calmly the morning of the meeting, adjusting his tie in front of the mirror. "The company I built, my position, my influence." "But not yourself," Emily replied, approaching from behind and hugging him. "And not us." He turned to look at her, searching her eyes for a certainty he no longer possessed. "How can you stay? How can you look at me after everything that's been revealed?" "Because I'm not in love with the perfect man you pretended to be," she replied simply. "I'm in love with the imperfect man you really are, the one who makes mistakes but tries to correct them, the one who's afraid but chooses courage anyway." The meeting was brutal. Shareholders were merciless, listing every newspaper headline, every lost client, every percentage point lost in stock value. James listened in silence, accepting their anger, not defending himself. When his turn came to speak, he surprised everyone. "You're right," he began calmly. "My presence is currently harming the company. I'll resign from my position as CEO. But before I leave, I want to say something." He looked at each person around the conference table. "For 20 years I've led this company with one priority, profit. And we succeeded. We're wealthy, but at what cost? How many of us can look at our children and be proud of every decision we've made?" The silence was deafening. "I'm not asking you to change," James continued, "but I'm asking you to reflect. Because I've learned recently that success without integrity is just a beautiful prison." He left the meeting without their vote, effectively resigning before they could fire him. It was a symbolic gesture, but important to him. Emily waited for him in the lobby, and when he emerged from the elevator, she saw something different in his expression. "How do you feel?" she asked cautiously. "Free," he replied, and for the first time in weeks, he was really smiling. Terrified and free. The following weeks were a period of deep introspection. James consulted Dr. Morrison 3 times a week, working on his tendency to define his worth through professional achievements. He began meditating, a practice Emily had done for years, and he'd always ridiculed as wasted time. "It's not wasted time if it saves your mental health," she argued, setting up meditation cushions on the balcony. Progressively, James began seeing the crisis not as an end, but as an opportunity to rebuild on more solid foundations. He contacted every person or company he'd harmed during his career, offering compensation when possible, sincere apologies when it wasn't. Not everyone accepted, and some rejections were particularly painful. "I thought making amends would be liberating," he admitted one evening, after a particularly difficult meeting with a former partner he'd betrayed. "But sometimes it's just painful." Growth hurts, Emily replied, but the alternative, staying the same person you were, would be worse. Emily, meanwhile, continued to excel in her courses. She completed her first major portfolio, a renovation project for a women's shelter, transforming cold institutional spaces into warm and welcoming environments on a minimal budget. Her professor, Professor Anderson, suggested she submit the project for a National Young Designers Award. I don't know, Emily hesitated. With all the media attention on James and me, I don't want my work judged on anything but its merit. Then submit it anonymously, Anderson suggested. Let the work speak for itself. She did, and 3 months later, she won second prize. When anonymity was lifted at the awards ceremony, journalists present immediately created a new narrative. From flight to glory, Emily Williams triumphs. But this time, Emily was stronger, more anchored in her own identity. Let them write what they want, she told James, reading the articles the next day. I know who I am, and you know who I am. That's all that matters. The true transformation began unexpectedly during a visit to the Wyoming ranch. James and Emily had decided to spend a month there, getting away from Manhattan and its media tumult, seeking peace in the countryside's simplicity. Claire joined them for the first week, bringing their mother, Helen, an elegant 68-year-old woman James hadn't seen since the dispute that separated them. The first meeting was tense. Helen and James looked at each other on the ranch's patio, with years of unspoken words between them. Emily and Claire discreetly withdrew, letting mother and son navigate this emotional minefield. You look like your father, were Helen's first words, her voice trembling slightly. I thought that was the worst thing you could say, James replied, remembering how she'd cried over the resemblance when he was a teenager. Your father was a good man who made mistakes, Helen said, sitting on a stone bench, like all of us. I spent so many years angry at him for losing our financial security that I forgot all the good things. His generosity, his kindness, his laugh. He lost everything, James said bitterly. He left us with nothing. He left us with love, Helen corrected, but you were too young and too scared to see it, and I was too bitter to show it to you. I taught you to equate vulnerability with weakness. I'm sorry. This conversation opened an emotional dam. James and his mother talked for hours, traversing decades of misunderstandings and wounds. Helen spoke of her own fear after her husband's death, of how she'd pushed James toward financial success because she didn't want him to know the insecurity she'd lived. James spoke of how that pressure had shaped his entire life, transforming him into someone he no longer recognized. And now? Helen asked. Who do you want to be? I don't know yet, James admitted. But Emily is helping me discover it. The stay in Wyoming became a time of collective healing. They worked together renovating the ranch, James discovering he loved manual work, the tangible satisfaction of fixing a window or repainting a wall. Emily progressively transformed the house with her designer's talent, creating spaces that respected the original architecture while bringing modern comfort. Claire taught Emily advanced quilting techniques, and together they created pillows and curtains adorned with Western patterns for the house. Helen, an accomplished cook, shared family recipes with Emily, creating a bridge between past and future. One evening, as they all dined together on the patio under the stars, James looked around the table, his mother laughing at one of Claire's jokes, Emily serving fragrant beef stew, wine flowing freely, and realized he was happier than he'd been in 20 years. What are you thinking? Emily asked, noticing his contemplative expression. That I spent 2 decades chasing something I now possess, he replied. A family, a home, a purpose. Returning to New York after the month in Wyoming, James made definitive decisions. He sold all his remaining stakes in companies whose ethical practices he questioned, even when it meant financial losses. He created a foundation, the Bennett Williams Foundation, dedicated to helping young entrepreneurs with socially responsible projects, as well as women fleeing oppressive situations. Emily became the foundation's creative director, using her design skills to create welcoming spaces in the shelters and aid centers the foundation supported. Her work attracted attention from specialized media, no longer for her association with James, but for her own talent. How do you feel now? Dr. Morrison asked during a session, 6 months after James's resignation. Different, he answered honestly. I have less money, less power, less respect in the circles I moved in. But I sleep better. I look in the mirror without disgust, and I love a woman who loves me for who I really am, not for what I own. You've rebuilt yourself, the therapist observed. No, James corrected. Emily helped me deconstruct myself, and now I'm rebuilding myself stone by stone on more solid foundations. The true test of their love came unexpectedly, as real tests always do. Emily received an extraordinary proposal to study design in London, with a full scholarship at one of Europe's most prestigious schools, Central St. Martin's. It was the chance of a lifetime, an opportunity that would transform her nascent career into something truly exceptional. She held the acceptance letter in trembling hands, torn between excitement and terror. A year in London, a year away from James, away from the life they were building together. She didn't know how to talk to him about it. James found her on the balcony that night, the letter resting on her lap, her eyes lost on Manhattan's lights. "What's wrong?" he asked, sitting beside her. Emily handed him the letter without a word. He read it slowly, and she watched his face, looking for signs of anger or sadness. Instead, she saw something unexpected: pride. "Emily, this is extraordinary," he said, an authentic smile lighting up his face. "Central St. Martin's. Do you know how many designers would kill for this opportunity?" "But it's a year in London," she murmured. "Away from you. Away from us." James took her hands in his, looking at her with an intensity that took her breath away. "Emily, listen to me carefully. I love you. That means I want what's best for you, even if it's difficult for me. This opportunity, you can't refuse it." "What if we don't survive the distance?" she asked, her greatest fear voiced aloud. "Then we weren't as strong as I believe," he replied simply. "But I think we are. I think our love can survive a year of distance. And if it can't, then it wasn't the right love." Tears flowed freely down Emily's cheeks. "I don't want to lose you." "You won't lose me," James promised. "I'll be here when you return, and during the year we'll find ways to stay connected." He kept his promise in ways Emily had never imagined. He funded her living expenses in London so she could focus on her studies without financial worries, but insisted she understand he was doing it not as a benefactor, but as a partner investing in their shared future. The departure was heartbreaking. At JFK Airport they embraced for a long time, ignoring the curious looks of other travelers. "1 year," James murmured into her hair. "And then you come back to me." "1 year," Emily repeated, clinging to him. "I promise." London was everything she'd hoped for and more. The school was demanding, the professors brilliant, the opportunities endless. Emily immersed herself in studies with a passion she didn't know she possessed. She discovered she excelled particularly in commercial space design, creating environments that balanced aesthetics and psychological functionality. But the distance was painful. They talked every day via video calls, sharing details of their days. James showed her the foundation's progress, the lives they were touching. Emily showed him her projects, her sketchbooks, London's beauty, but it wasn't the same as being together. James visited her 3 times during the year. The first time at Christmas they explored snowy London together, visiting the illuminated British Museum and sharing mince pies in cosy cafes. The second time in spring, they spent a weekend in Bath, reconnecting in a romantic hotel overlooking the Roman baths. The third time in summer, he attended her final portfolio exhibition, beaming with pride in the crowded gallery. "You're incredible," he murmured during the opening, watching professors and industry professionals rave about Emily's work. "I couldn't have done this without you," she replied. "Your support, your faith in me, that's what gave me courage." "No," he corrected gently. "I just saw what was already there. The courage was always yours." The year passed, painfully slow sometimes, surprisingly fast others. Emily graduated with honors, and several London design studios offered her positions. It was tempting. London was intoxicating, the opportunities extraordinary. But her heart was in New York, with a man who'd let her go so she could fly. Emily's return to New York was triumphant. James waited for her at the airport with a huge bouquet of magnolias, her favorite scent, the one that reminded her of her Tennessee home. When she emerged from baggage claim, their eyes met across the crowd, and they ran toward each other like in a romantic film. "I missed you so much," he murmured, hugging her so tight she could barely breathe. "I missed you every second of every day," she replied, breathing in his familiar scent, finally feeling home. Emily returned transformed, still the same essentially pure and kind person, but now emancipated, aware of her worth and capabilities. She'd learned to speak fluent English without her southern accent when needed, made international friendships, presented her projects to hundreds of people with confidence. The year of separation, as difficult as it was, had made them both grow individually, making their union even stronger. She discovered how much James had changed too. The foundation was now operating at full capacity, helping dozens of young entrepreneurs and hundreds of women in transition. He'd reduced his lifestyle even more, selling the luxurious Manhattan penthouse for something smaller but warmer in Brooklyn Heights. "You sold the penthouse?" Emily exclaimed, surprised. "It was too big, too cold, too full of memories of the man I was," James explained. "I wanted to start over. With you. If you agree, of course." The new apartment was perfect. A high floor with a terrace in a historic building with exposed beams and a working fireplace. Enough space to live and work, but intimate and welcoming. Emily could already imagine how she'd decorate it. "It's perfect," she said, moved. "It's a real home." The following weeks were full of readjustments and rediscoveries. They learned to truly live together now, no longer as host and guest or even as a beginning couple, but as committed partners building a shared life. There were frictions. Emily wanted more plants than James thought reasonable. James worked late and forgot to eat dinner. Emily left her sketchbooks everywhere. But they navigated these small conflicts with patience and humor, always remembering why they'd chosen to be together. Emily opened her own design studio, specialized in social impact spaces, shelters, community centers, schools in disadvantaged neighborhoods. James became her first client, hiring her studio to design all the foundation spaces. "We should separate professional from personal," Emily suggested one evening, reviewing floor plans on the kitchen table. "Why?" James asked, bringing 2 glasses of Oregon Pinot Noir. "We're partners in everything. Why not in work too?" And so they found their rhythm, working together but respecting each other's autonomy, living together but maintaining individual spaces, loving intensely but allowing personal growth. The culminating moment came during a seemingly ordinary evening. They were at the Wyoming ranch for the weekend, enjoying early fall. The sky was incredibly clear, saturated with stars. James had prepared a fire in the garden, and they sat side by side, wrapped in blankets, listening to the nocturnal sounds of the countryside. "Emily," James began, his voice unusually nervous, "a year ago, when you left for London, I was afraid. Afraid of losing you, afraid you'd realize you deserved better than me. But you came back." "Of course I came back," she said, puzzled by his tone. "I spent 43 years building walls," he continued, turning to look at her directly. "Believing success was measured in millions and power. And then you appeared, soaked and terrified, asking for tenderness. And you destroyed every wall, stone by stone, showing me that a well-lived life is measured in shared love and precious moments." He pulled a small box from his pocket, and Emily felt her heart stop. "I'm not perfect. I'll always be a work in progress. But I want to spend the rest of my life being better for you, with you. Emily Williams, will you marry me?" The ring was simple but beautiful, a sapphire surrounded by small diamonds set in white gold. "It belonged to my grandmother," James explained, "the woman who taught me that true love is patient and kind." "Yes," Emily murmured, tears flowing freely. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." They kissed under Wyoming stars, the fire crackling beside them, 2 once-lost souls now found in each other's arms. The announcement of their engagement provoked mixed reactions as they expected. Some in James's social circles were scandalized, the age difference, the circumstances, the speed. But many more congratulated them sincerely, witnesses to the positive transformation their love had brought. Emily's family sent a representative, Grandmother Marguerite, the 84-year-old matriarch everyone respected. She took the train alone from Tennessee, insisting that at her age she wasn't afraid of travel. She spent a week in the new apartment, observing everything with her penetrating eyes that seemed to see souls. She observed how James treated her granddaughter, with evident respect, natural tenderness, with an equality that didn't exist in her hometown's traditional relationships. She saw how Emily flourished, how her eyes shone when she talked about her projects, how she laughed freely. She saw a love based on mutual admiration rather than obligation or convention. Before leaving, Marguerite took both their hands and said something that would remain engraved in their hearts. True love isn't measured by age or money, but by how the person makes your eyes shine. And Emily, your eyes shine like I've never seen them. James, take care of this gift. She gave her public blessing to their union, and this approval progressively opened doors with the rest of Emily's family. Marguerite's approval didn't bring immediate peace, but it created a possibility of reconciliation. Emily's father, Robert, sent an awkward but sincere letter, apologizing for his rigidity and inviting the couple to visit whenever they wished. Some endings are really beginnings. The wedding took place a year later, exactly 3 years after that rainy night when Emily had appeared soaked in the building's lobby. It was at the renovated Wyoming ranch, now transformed into a magnificent space that respected its historical character, while offering modern comfort. The wildflower meadows surrounding the property were in full bloom, creating a golden ocean rippling in the summer breeze. The sky was a deep and perfect blue without a cloud, as if the universe itself conspired to make this day flawless. Vintage lanterns hung from century-old pines, waiting to illuminate at dusk. Rustic wooden tables were arranged in the garden, decorated with bouquets of wildflowers and sage that Emily and Claire had gathered that morning. It wasn't the luxurious ceremony many expected from a millionaire. No professional wedding planner, no expensive florist, no guest list including hundreds of business contacts. Instead, it was an intimate celebration with only 75 people, each truly important in their lives. Both families were present, finally united after years of separation and mistrust. Robert and Margaret, Emily's parents, stood near Helen and her children, an improbable image 3 years before. Uncles and aunts from Tennessee mingled with James's colleagues from his new philanthropic projects. Emily's friends from design school chatted animatedly with Claire and her art conservator friends. Mrs. Chen, who'd followed James through his life transition, prepared a feast with Emily's family's help. Traditional Southern barbecue cooked in a huge smoker, scents of hickory and spices filling the air, mixed with the intoxicating fragrance of wildflowers. Local musicians, a fiddler, a guitarist, and a banjo player, played traditional American folk melodies, creating a festive but authentic atmosphere. It was exactly the type of celebration Emily had always dreamed of. Simple, warm, full of true love rather than ostentation. Emily wore a dress she'd designed herself with Claire's help. Lace in ivory with embroidered details, simple but elegant, perfectly reflecting her personality. In her hair, braided in a crown, she wore sprigs of fresh baby's breath. James, in a perfectly tailored light grey suit, couldn't take his eyes off her. The ceremony took place under a particularly majestic pine tree that James had specially reinforced for the occasion. The officiant was an old friend of Emily's family, a man who'd known 3 generations and understood the significance of this union. When it came time to exchange the vows they'd written, Emily spoke first, her clear voice carrying in the attentive silence. "James, 3 years ago, I arrived at your door with nothing. No luggage, no plans, just a desperate prayer for tenderness. You gave me so much more than that. You gave me a space to discover myself, the courage to pursue my dreams, and a love that allows me to be fully myself. You showed me that being strong doesn't mean never falling, but rising each time with more wisdom. I promise to walk by your side, to support you in your moments of doubt, to celebrate your victories, and to always remind you who you really are when the world tries to define you otherwise." Tears flowed openly on several faces in the assembly. James took a deep breath before beginning. "Emily, for 42 years I lived like a fortress, protected, isolated, invulnerable. And then you appeared, and with relentless gentleness you destroyed every wall I'd built. You taught me that true strength lies in vulnerability, that true success is measured in lives touched rather than profits accumulated, and that true love transforms us into better versions of ourselves. I promise to cherish you, to protect your dreams as fiercely as my own, to make you laugh when you're sad, and to always remind you of your extraordinary light, especially on days when you can't see it yourself." There was barely a dry eye when they exchanged rings. Simple gold bands engraved inside with the date of their first meeting. The kiss, when the officiant declared them married, was sweet, tender, and charged with all the meaning of their journey together. The reception that followed was magical. The food was extraordinary, not for its gastronomic sophistication, but for the love with which it was prepared. The barbecue was served on traditional plates, accompanied by cornbread and coleslaw. Trays of local cheeses circulated, with regional wines chosen for their quality rather than price. The speeches were touching and authentic. Claire spoke of rediscovering her brother through Emily's eyes, of seeing him find the humanity he'd buried. Robert, with tears in his eyes and emotion-roughened voice, publicly apologized for trying to control his daughter's life, acknowledging she'd made the right choice in choosing her own path. "My daughter taught me," he said, looking at Emily and James, "that truly loving someone means letting them be free. I tried to keep her in a gilded cage of traditions and expectations. James gave her wings. For that, I'll be eternally grateful." Marguerite, now 85, stood up despite protests and spoke with the wisdom of someone who's lived long and well. "When Emily left 3 years ago, I cried. I thought we'd lost her. But today, I see we didn't lose her, we found her. And she found a man who honors her. May your marriage be blessed with the tenderness that heals, the laughter that lightens, and the love that transforms." When the sun began to descend, painting the sky with spectacular pinks, oranges, and purples, the lanterns lit, creating a fairy tale atmosphere. The fiddler played a slow waltz, and James took Emily's hand for their first dance as husband and wife. They turned slowly under the illuminated pines, lost in their own world, aware of the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. "What are you thinking?" Emily murmured, her head resting against his shoulder. "That if I'd known 3 years ago that this soaked young woman who would appear at my door would become my wife, my partner, my reason to become better." He stopped, his voice charged with emotion. "I would have opened that door so much faster." Emily laughed softly. "You opened it exactly when you should have, not too soon, not too late, just at the right time." As the night progressed, guests danced, ate, laughed, and celebrated. Children ran between tables, their laughter carried in the warm summer air. Generations mixed, elders telling stories of the past, young people talking about the future. It was exactly the type of celebration James never would have imagined wanting 3 years before, and now he couldn't imagine anything more perfect. Later in the evening, James and Emily slipped away briefly from the party, walking hand in hand to the top of the hill overlooking the property. From there, they could see the entire illuminated scene below. Lanterns shining like giant fireflies, silhouettes of guests dancing, the echo of music and laughter carrying in the night air. "We really did it," Emily murmured, moved. "We built something beautiful." "You built something beautiful," James corrected. "I just let you show me how." Emily turned to look at him, taking his face in her hands. "No, we built it together. That's the point. Neither you nor I alone could have created this. It's our mutual creation. In the years that would follow, and there would be many, filled with joys and challenges, continuous growth and deepened love, they would often return to this moment, standing on that Wyoming hill, watching the celebration of their union, realizing that true happiness doesn't come from perfection, but from authenticity. Not from possession, but from partnership. Not from avoiding pain, but from transformation through it. James Bennet finally understood, that night under the stars with his wife by his side, that his true legacy wouldn't be measured in accumulated millions or built empires. It would be measured in lives touched by the foundation they ran together, in shelters transformed into homes by Emily's sensitive design, in young entrepreneurs guided toward ethical practices, and above all, in the love they shared and radiated toward everyone around them. Emily, in turn, had found much more than refuge that rainy night 3 years before. She'd found her voice, her strength, her purpose. She'd proven that leaving doesn't mean abandoning, but sometimes honoring one's soul. That courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply whispers, "I choose me." Looking at the stars that night, surrounded by everything she and James had created together, Emily felt deep gratitude for that version of herself who'd been brave enough to ring an unknown door asking for tenderness. Because asking for what you need, whether it's tenderness, love, help, or simply to be seen, isn't weakness. It's the bravest act there is. And sometimes when you find the courage to ask, the universe conspires to give you much more than you asked for. It gives you exactly what you need to become who you're meant to be. True love doesn't complete us, it reveals us. It doesn't save us, it gives us a safe space to save ourselves. And in this mutual salvation, we find not only each other but also ourselves transformed and free. As the music continued to play below and the first light of dawn began to paint the eastern horizon, James and Emily descended the hill to rejoin their celebration, hand in hand, ready to embrace whatever the future held for them, because they would face it together, and together they could do anything.